I paid for my sister's education, while working two jobs, only for her to call me a loser at a family dinner. She was shocked when I stopped paying her rent and told everyone exactly why she could no longer afford her lifestyle. I, 28 male, need to get this off my chest because what happened last month has completely changed my relationship with my family forever. This is about my younger sister Emma, who's 24, and how years of sacrifice on my part led to the most humiliating moment of my life, followed by the most satisfying revenge I've ever gotten. Let me start from the beginning so you understand the full picture of just how messed up my family dynamics have always been. Growing up, Emma was the golden child. She's 4 years younger than me, and from the moment she could walk and talk, my parents treated her like she was destined for greatness, while I was just there to support her dreams. I'm not exaggerating when I say that every single family decision revolved around what was best for Emma. When she was 8 and wanted to take ballet lessons, my parents immediately signed her up for the most expensive classes in town. When I asked if I could join the soccer team that same year, they said we couldn't afford both activities, and Emma's dance was more important because she had natural talent. That became the theme of my entire childhood. Emma's needs always came first because she was supposedly gifted. The favoritism was so obvious that even other family members noticed. My Aunt Carol used to make comments about how Emma could do no wrong in my parents' eyes, while I seemed to be an afterthought. But whenever anyone brought it up directly to my parents, they would get defensive and claim they treated us equally. They were either lying or completely delusional. Emma learned early on that she could get away with anything. She'd break my stuff, and I'd get in trouble for leaving it where she could reach it. I remember when she destroyed a model airplane I'd spent weeks building, and my parents made me apologize to her for being careless with my toys around your little sister. She'd throw tantrums when she didn't get her way, and my parents would immediately give her whatever she wanted to stop the crying. Meanwhile, if I so much as raised my voice, I'd be grounded for a week. The worst part was how they handled our academic achievements. Emma was naturally smart, I'll give her that, but she was also lazy. She'd do the bare minimum and still get praise to high heaven when she brought home B's and C's. My parents would celebrate her report cards, like she'd cured cancer, taking her out for ice cream and calling the grandparents to brag. I, on the other hand, had to work my ass off for A's, and my parents' response was always, "We expect nothing less from you," or "You should be helping your sister study instead of focusing only on yourself." I remember one particularly painful incident in 8th grade when Emma got a C+ in math and my parents threw her a celebration dinner at her favorite restaurant. That same week, I'd gotten straight A's and made honor roll, but dinner that night was all about Emma's improvement in mathematics. When I pointed out that I'd made honor roll, my dad said, "That's great, but Emma is really trying hard and that's what matters." When it came time for college, the inequality reached new heights. Emma was a senior in high school when I was finishing my sophomore year of community college. Yes, community college, because my parents had spent my college fund on Emma's private art classes, music lessons, and all her other talents. They told me I was smart enough to get scholarships, and that Emma needed more help because academics didn't come as naturally to her. The irony was that I'd been working part-time since I was 16 to help pay for my own expenses, while Emma had never held a job in her life. She spent her afternoons at various lessons and her weekends at competitions or workshops, all funded by our parents. Meanwhile, I was bagging groceries and doing homework in the employee break room during my shifts. That's when Emma announced she wanted to go to Parsons School of Design in New York City. For those who don't know, that's one of the most expensive art schools in the country. Tuition alone was over $50,000 a year, not including living expenses in Manhattan. The total cost would be well over $200,000 for 4 years. My parents sat me down for what they called a family meeting, but was really just them telling me I needed to help make Emma's dreams come true. They'd already committed to paying for her first year, draining most of their savings and taking out a home equity loan to cover it. But they needed me to contribute for the remaining 3 years. They suggested I could transfer to a state school, get a job, and send Emma money every month. I was 19 years old, and they were asking me to sacrifice my education and my future so my sister could pursue art in the most expensive city in the country. When I pointed out how unfair this was, my mother actually started crying and said I was being selfish. She said Emma had so much talent and potential, and that it would be a tragedy if she couldn't pursue her dreams because of money. My father added that as the older sibling, I had a responsibility to help Emma succeed. The emotional manipulation was unreal. They made me feel like I'd be destroying Emma's life if I didn't agree to help. They kept saying things like, "Family helps family," and "Someday you'll understand that Emma's success is the family's success." They painted this picture where Emma would become a famous designer and we'd all benefit from her success. But I needed to invest in her now. They brought out photo albums of Emma's artwork from childhood, showing me drawings and paintings that they said proved her exceptional talent. They talked about teachers who had praised her creativity and art instructors who said she had real potential. They made it sound like not supporting Emma's education would be like preventing the next Picasso from achieving greatness. Like an idiot, I agreed. I was young and still believed that if I just tried hard enough, my parents would eventually see my worth. I thought that if I made this sacrifice, they'd finally acknowledge everything I'd done for the family. I also genuinely loved my sister, despite everything, and I didn't want to be the reason her dreams didn't come true. I dropped out of college after my sophomore year and got 2 jobs. During the day, I worked at a marketing firm as an assistant, making barely above minimum wage but getting valuable experience. The work was mind-numbing, mostly filing, data entry, and answering phones. But I told myself I was learning about business. At night and on weekends, I worked at a restaurant as a server and busboy. I was pulling 60 to 70-hour weeks just to send Emma $2,000 a month for her living expenses in New York, while my parents covered her tuition. Let me be clear about what $2,000 a month meant for someone making what I was making. After taxes, I was taking home maybe $3,200 a month total from both jobs. I was sending Emma more than half my income, keeping $1,200 for myself to cover my own rent, food, transportation, and everything else. I was living in a studio apartment that was basically a glorified closet, eating ramen noodles for dinner most nights, and walking to work to save on gas money. The apartment was in a sketchy part of town because it was all I could afford. The building had no air conditioning, thin walls, and a persistent smell of cigarettes and mold. I slept on a futon because I couldn't afford a real bed, and I ate off paper plates because I didn't have money for dishes. Meanwhile, Emma was living in a nice apartment in Brooklyn, going out to trendy restaurants and posting Instagram photos of her amazing New York lifestyle. She'd call home every week to tell our parents about the gallery opening she was attending, the famous artists she was meeting, and the incredible professors who were mentoring her. I'd be sitting there after working a 12-hour day, exhausted and barely scraping by, listening to her talk about her fabulous life that I was funding. She described the expensive art supplies she was buying, the Broadway shows she was seeing, and the weekend trips she was taking to the Hamptons with her new friends. She talked about designer coffee shops where she'd spend hours sketching, boutique clothing stores where she'd shop for her artistic aesthetic, and networking events at upscale galleries. Every detail of her life sounded glamorous and exciting, while I was working myself to death just to make it possible. The worst part was that Emma never once thanked me directly. She'd occasionally mention in front of our parents that she was grateful for everyone's support, but she never acknowledged the specific sacrifices I was making. It was like she thought the money just magically appeared in her account every month. This went on for 3 years. 3 years of me working myself to the bone while Emma lived her best life in New York. I watched all my friends graduate college, start careers, get promoted, buy houses, and move forward with their lives, while I was stuck in this cycle of working just to pay for my sister's dreams. My high school friends would invite me to gatherings, but I usually couldn't afford to go, or I had to work. They started inviting me less frequently, and I felt increasingly isolated. I missed out on internships that could have advanced my career because I couldn't afford to take unpaid positions. I turned down job opportunities that would have required me to move because I couldn't risk disrupting my income stream that Emma depended on. I postponed every personal goal and ambition because Emma's needs always came first. Emma graduated last spring with a degree in fashion design. The whole family went to her graduation ceremony in New York, which was another expense I couldn't really afford, but felt obligated to cover. Watching her walk across that stage, knowing I'd paid for her to be there, was bittersweet. I was proud of her for finishing, but I also felt this deep resentment that I'd given up my own education for hers. The graduation ceremony was held at Lincoln Center, and everything about it was expensive and elaborate. Emma looked beautiful in her cap and gown, beaming as she accepted her diploma. Our parents were crying with pride, taking hundreds of photos and videos. I felt like an outsider at my own sister's graduation, knowing that I'd made it possible but wouldn't be credited for it. After graduation, Emma decided she wasn't ready to get a full-time job because she wanted to explore her artistic vision and network within the industry. She moved back home with our parents but kept her apartment in Brooklyn because she said she needed to maintain her presence in the city for her career. So I was still sending her $2,000 a month to cover her Brooklyn rent while she was living rent-free at home. When I pointed out that this seemed unnecessary, my parents said Emma needed time to establish herself and that rushing into a corporate job would stifle her creativity. They made it sound like I was being unreasonable for suggesting she might want to start supporting herself after graduating college. Emma would go back to New York every few weeks for what she called industry events, but seemed to mostly be parties and social gatherings. She'd post photos of herself at expensive restaurants and trendy bars, wearing designer outfits and networking with other aspiring artists, all while I was still working 2 jobs to fund her lifestyle. She started developing this attitude where she acted like she was too sophisticated for our hometown, making comments about how provincial everything was compared to New York. She'd come home from these trips with shopping bags full of expensive clothes and art supplies, justifying every purchase as a professional necessity. The clothes were for networking events. The supplies were for her portfolio. The expensive dinners were for meeting potential clients. Everything was somehow essential for her career, and by extension, my financial responsibility. The breaking point came last month at our family's monthly dinner. My parents always insisted we get together once a month to stay connected as a family, which really meant another opportunity for them to fawn over Emma's artistic pursuits while I sat there like furniture. This particular dinner was supposed to be a celebration because Emma had gotten some small feature in an online art blog. Nothing major, just a brief mention of her work in an article about emerging designers. But my parents were acting like she'd won a Pulitzer Prize. They'd printed out copies of the article to show everyone and kept talking about how proud they were of their artist daughter. Emma was eating it up, going on and on about her creative process and her vision for her brand. She was wearing this designer outfit that probably cost more than I made in a week, talking about how she was cultivating her aesthetic and building her portfolio. She used art terminology that went over everyone's heads, describing her work as exploring the intersection of textile innovation and social commentary. The whole time, I'm sitting there in clothes I'd bought at Target 2 years ago, thinking about how I'd worked a double shift the day before to make sure her rent check wouldn't bounce. I was exhausted. My feet were sore from standing all day at the restaurant, and I had to get up early the next morning to open the office. Then my dad made this toast about how grateful they were to have such a talented daughter, and how Emma's success was proof that investing in education and following your dreams pays off. He was looking right at Emma when he said this, completely ignoring the fact that I was the one who'd actually invested in her education while giving up my own dreams. That's when Emma decided to share her thoughts about the family dynamics. She said, and I quote, "I'm just so grateful that I've been able to focus on my art without having to worry about money like some people. I mean, look at my brother. He's almost 30 and still working 2 dead-end jobs because he never finished college. It just shows how important it is to stay committed to your goals instead of taking shortcuts." The room went dead silent. Even my parents looked uncomfortable, though they didn't say anything to correct her. Emma continued, completely oblivious to how insulting she was being. "I really hope my brother can figure out his life someday. It's kind of sad to see someone with so little ambition. Like, he could have finished college if he'd really wanted to, but he chose the easy path of just working instead of studying. I guess some people are just born to be workers instead of leaders." She said this while sitting in the restaurant that I'd helped pay for, wearing clothes I'd helped buy, fresh off a graduation I'd funded, talking about an apartment I was currently paying rent on. She called me a loser for working 2 jobs, when the only reason she hadn't needed to work was because I was working 2 jobs for her. I sat there for a moment, trying to process the audacity of what she'd just said. Then I started laughing. Not a happy laugh, but the kind of laugh you do when something is so absurd you can't quite believe it's real. My parents asked what was funny, and I said, "Oh, just thinking about how interesting it is that Emma thinks she's been supporting herself this whole time." Emma looked confused and asked what I meant. So I explained, very clearly and calmly, that I'd been sending her $2,000 every month for the past 3.5 years to cover her living expenses. I laid out exactly how much money I'd given her, over $80,000 total, and how I'd been working 2 jobs and living like a college student in my late 20s to fund her lifestyle. Quick pause, fellas. YouTube just dropped this new hype feature. If you're hooked on this story, smash that hype button. It tells YouTube this video deserves to blow up, and it keeps even crazier stories coming your way. Thanks so much for your support. All right, back to the drama. The look on her face was priceless. Complete shock, like she'd never connected the dots between the money appearing in her account and the fact that I was always working. My parents were staring at their plates, clearly uncomfortable with having the family's financial arrangements exposed so publicly. I continued, "So when you talk about how sad it is that I'm working 2 jobs and haven't finished college, you might want to remember that the only reason you haven't needed to work is because I've been working for both of us. You've spent the last 4 years focusing on your art because I've been focusing on paying your bills. Emma tried to backtrack, saying she had no idea I was contributing that much, and that she thought our parents were covering everything. I pointed out that she'd never bothered to ask where the money was coming from. She'd just accepted it as her due. Then I said the words that felt so good to get out. Well, the good news is that you won't have to feel sad about my situation anymore because I'm done. No more money from me. You graduated 4 months ago, which means you're officially an adult with a college degree. Time to start acting like one. Emma immediately started crying, asking what she was supposed to do about her apartment. I suggested she might want to get a job, like most college graduates do. She said she wasn't ready for a corporate job and needed more time to develop her artistic career. I told her that was her choice, but she'd need to find another way to pay for it because I was finished being her personal bank. My parents finally spoke up, with my mother saying I was being too harsh and that Emma needed more support as she transitioned to independence. My father added that I was abandoning the family when Emma needed me most. I looked at both of them and said, "Where was this concern for gradual transitions when you asked me to drop out of college at 19 to support Emma? Where was the worry about being too harsh when you told me I needed to sacrifice my education for hers?" I've been transitioning Emma to independence for 3.5 years by paying her bills. The transition is over. I put money on the table to cover my meal and walked out. As I was leaving, I could hear Emma sobbing and my parents trying to console her, probably already planning how they were going to guilt me into changing my mind. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. Within hours, I was getting calls and texts from my parents demanding that I reconsider. They said Emma was having a panic attack about her apartment and that I was being cruel and selfish. They offered to mediate the situation, which really meant they wanted to pressure me into continuing to pay Emma's expenses. I told them that if they were so concerned about Emma's apartment, they were welcome to take over the payments themselves. Suddenly, they weren't quite as insistent that Emma needed the support. Funny how that works. Emma called me crying, saying she was sorry for what she'd said at dinner and that she hadn't meant to hurt my feelings. She claimed she'd just gotten carried away talking about success and hadn't thought about how her words sounded. She begged me not to cut off her funding, saying she'd already committed to the apartment lease and couldn't afford to break it. I told her I appreciated the apology, but my decision was final. I explained that her comments at dinner weren't just careless words. They reflected how she actually viewed me and my contributions to her life. She saw me as a failure despite the fact that I'd been supporting her for years, which meant she'd never truly appreciated what I was doing for her. The next few weeks were a masterclass in family manipulation. My parents tried every angle they could think of to get me to change my mind. They started with guilt, talking about how Emma was family and family doesn't abandon each other. When that didn't work, they tried anger, accusing me of being vindictive and destroying Emma's future over hurt feelings. They brought up every favor they'd ever done for me, trying to create some kind of debt obligation. They reminded me of Christmas presents from childhood, times they'd picked me up from school when I was sick, the fact that they'd raised me for 18 years, as if being fed and housed as a child created a lifetime obligation to fund my sister's artistic ambitions. My mother even tried to make it about Emma's mental health, claiming that the stress of potentially losing her apartment was causing Emma to have anxiety attacks. She said I was prioritizing money over my sister's well-being, conveniently ignoring the fact that I'd been prioritizing my sister's well-being over my own financial stability for years. The most frustrating part was how they kept acting like I was the unreasonable one. They couldn't understand why I was making such a big deal out of Emma's comments at dinner. According to them, I was being oversensitive and vindictive, throwing away years of family investment over a few poorly chosen words. But here's what they didn't understand. Emma's comments weren't just insulting, they were revealing. They showed that despite everything I'd done for her, she genuinely believed she was more successful and ambitious than me. She thought I was working 2 jobs because I was lazy and unmotivated, not because I was supporting her lifestyle. She had completely rewritten the narrative in her head to make herself the hero of her own success story. Meanwhile, Emma was scrambling to figure out her finances. She called me several times trying different approaches, sometimes apologetic, sometimes angry, sometimes trying to negotiate a gradual reduction in support rather than an immediate cutoff. She suggested I could reduce the monthly amount slowly over 6 months to give her time to adjust. I told her that I'd already given her 4 months since graduation to adjust, plus advance notice through our previous conversations about her needing to become independent. The gradual reduction had been the 4 years I'd supported her through college, with the understanding that she'd be self-sufficient after graduating. 2 weeks after the dinner, Emma had to give up her Brooklyn apartment. She tried to find a roommate situation, but most of the places she could afford were far from the trendy neighborhoods where she'd been networking. She ended up moving back home full-time and taking a part-time job at a local art supply store. The job paid minimum wage and was definitely not the glamorous artist lifestyle she'd been living in New York. She had to learn how to operate a cash register, help customers find supplies, and stock shelves. All things she'd never done before because she'd never needed to work. She had to start taking the train into the city for industry events instead of living there, which meant much less frequent trips and missing out on the spontaneous networking opportunities she'd been enjoying. The commute was expensive and time-consuming, and she could only afford to go into the city for the most important events. My parents were furious with me for forcing Emma into this situation. They kept insisting that I was sabotaging her career just as it was taking off, and that the small feature in the art blog proved she was on the verge of big things. They said that if I just supported her for a few more months, she might have landed a major opportunity that would have made her financially independent. I pointed out that there would always be another few more months and another opportunity just around the corner. Emma had been out of college for 4 months and hadn't made any serious effort to find employment or reduce her expenses. If anything, she'd been spending more money on networking events and portfolio development, treating her post-graduation period like an extended vacation funded by me. The reality is that Emma had never learned to manage money or live within her means because she'd never had to. She'd gone straight from being supported by our parents to being supported by me, with a brief overlap where she was being supported by both. She was 24 years old and had never had to budget, never had to choose between social events and rent money, never had to consider whether she could afford something before buying it. My cutting off support forced her to confront real-world financial realities for the first time in her adult life. She had to figure out how much money she actually needed to live, what expenses were necessities versus luxuries, and how to prioritize her spending. It was a crash course in adulthood that she should have gotten years earlier. The most satisfying part came about a month after I cut off funding. Emma posted a long, dramatic social media post about how she was reassessing her priorities and learning to appreciate the simple things in life. She talked about how living at home was giving her a new perspective on family, and how her part-time job was teaching her about honest work and connecting with regular people. She was trying to spin her situation as a deliberate choice for personal growth rather than the financial necessity it actually was. But anyone who knew the real story could see through the rhetoric. She was working retail because she had to, not because she wanted to gain life experience. Several family members who'd witnessed the dinner reached out to me privately to say they supported my decision. My Aunt Carol, who'd always noticed the favoritism, told me she was proud of me for finally standing up for myself. She said she'd been wanting to say something for years, but hadn't felt it was her place to interfere. My cousin Jason, who was around Emma's age, said he'd always thought the arrangement was unfair and couldn't believe my parents had expected me to sacrifice my education for Emma's. He pointed out that Emma could have gone to a less expensive school, taken out student loans like most people, or worked part-time during college to help with expenses. These conversations helped me realize that the situation had been more obviously problematic to outsiders than I'd understood at the time. When you're in the middle of family dysfunction, it's easy to normalize things that are actually completely unreasonable. 3 months after cutting off support, I used the money I'd been sending Emma to finally go back to college and finish my degree. I enrolled in night classes while continuing to work during the day, and for the first time in years, I was working toward my own goals instead of funding someone else's dreams. The irony wasn't lost on me that Emma's comments about me not finishing college had directly motivated me to re-enroll. Her insults about my lack of ambition had reminded me that I'd only dropped out to support her, and that I could go back now, that I wasn't carrying her financial burden. My parents tried one more manipulation tactic around this time. They suggested that since I was going back to school, I'd understand how expensive education was, and would want to help Emma pursue additional training or certifications in her field. They said that just like I was investing in my future through education, Emma needed continued investment to establish her career. I laughed and told them that the difference was, I was paying for my own education with money I earned, while they were asking me to pay for Emma's continued education with money I also earned. If Emma wanted additional training, she could take out loans or save up money from her job like every other adult. Emma and I barely spoke during this period. She was clearly angry about losing her financial support and embarrassed about having to move back home and take a retail job. I think she also resented that I was going back to school, because it highlighted that I'd only stopped my education to fund hers. The few conversations we had were tense and awkward. She'd make passive-aggressive comments about how some people had the luxury of prioritizing their own goals, or how nice it must be to not have to worry about supporting anyone else. I'd remind her that I'd spent 4 years worrying about supporting her, and now it was my turn to focus on myself. The breaking point in Emma's situation came about 4 months after I cut off support. She'd been struggling to maintain her art career while working retail, and the stress was clearly getting to her. She'd had to miss several important industry events because she couldn't afford the time off work or the expenses associated with networking in the city. She finally swallowed her pride and started applying for full-time jobs in her field. It took a few weeks, but she eventually landed a position as a junior designer at a small firm in the city. The salary wasn't huge, but it was enough for her to afford a modest apartment with roommates and start building actual career experience. This was exactly what should have happened months earlier, but she'd been too proud and too financially cushioned to take entry-level work seriously. Having to support herself forced her to accept that starting careers often involve less than glamorous positions, and that financial independence requires making practical choices. When Emma got the job, my parents tried to give me partial credit, saying that my tough love had motivated her to take her career more seriously. I told them that what had happened wasn't tough love. It was me refusing to continue enabling Emma's avoidance of adult responsibilities. By this point, I'd been back in school for several months and was remembering how much I'd enjoyed learning and intellectual challenges. I was taking business and marketing classes that were directly relevant to my work experience, and I could see how completing my degree would open up new career opportunities. I also started dating someone I'd met in one of my classes. Sarah was a few years younger than me, but had gone straight through college and was working on her master's degree while working full-time. She couldn't understand how my family had thought it was reasonable to ask me to drop out to support my sister, and her perspective helped me see how abnormal the situation had really been. Around the 6-month mark after cutting off Emma's support, we finally had an honest conversation about what had happened. She admitted that she'd taken my financial help for granted and had never really thought about what it cost me personally. She said she'd been so focused on her own goals and struggles that she hadn't considered how her lifestyle was being funded. She also acknowledged that her comments at the dinner had been cruel and unfair, and that she'd been feeling defensive about not having a real job while I was working 2 jobs. She said she'd tried to make herself feel better by convincing herself that her artistic pursuits were more valuable than regular work, which led to her dismissive comments about my career choices. This conversation was a turning point in our relationship. While I couldn't immediately forgive years of entitlement and disrespect, I appreciated her finally taking responsibility for her behavior and acknowledging the sacrifices I'd made for her. We started rebuilding our relationship slowly, with clear boundaries about financial expectations and mutual respect. Emma never asked me for money again, and she made sure to acknowledge my help when talking about her college experience. She also started paying me back small amounts from her new job, which I hadn't asked for but appreciated as a gesture of accountability. My relationship with my parents took longer to repair. They had a harder time acknowledging their role in creating the dysfunctional dynamic, and they continued to defend their past decisions as being in Emma's best interest. They couldn't understand why I was still upset about things that had happened years earlier, and they wanted me to just move on and restore family harmony. It took several difficult conversations for them to understand that moving on couldn't happen without first acknowledging what had gone wrong and making changes to prevent similar situations in the future. They needed to recognize that their extreme favoritism had damaged both of their children, me through neglect and exploitation, and Emma through enabling her to avoid developing independence and resilience. Eventually, my parents did start to understand how their choices had affected our family dynamics. My mother admitted that she'd been so worried about Emma's future as an artist that she'd lost sight of fairness and my needs. My father acknowledged that asking me to drop out of college had been wrong, and that they should have found other ways to support Emma's education if they couldn't afford it themselves.